The wind cut like knives through the threadbare wool of Sarah Winter's coat. October had turned cruel in Riverdale, Montana, stripping the last warmth from the air and leaving only the promise of a bitter winter ahead. Early snowflakes danced around her, melting as they touched the cobblestones of the town square. Sarah's fingers had gone numb hours ago, her cracked leather boots, held together with wire and prayer, scraping against the stones. She kept her head down, trying to be invisible among the townsfolk who packed wagons after the harvest festival. Their laughter felt sharp as broken glass against her ears. A hand clamped onto her shoulder with sudden force, spinning her around. Sarah found herself staring into the flushed, angry face of Raymond Blackwell. "Thought you could hide from me." His breath reeked of whiskey, his fine wool coat a stark contrast to her tattered garments. As the banker's son and the mayor's pride, Raymond carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything. "You can't run forever, Sarah. That debt isn't going away." Around them, townsfolk slowed their movements, turning to watch the confrontation with barely concealed interest. Sarah felt their eyes like physical weight on her shoulders. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. "I just need more time." Raymond's fingers dug deeper into her flesh. "Time? You've had months. Every penny your worthless husband owed falls to you now." Sarah tried to pull away, but Raymond held firm. The fear that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death now surged like a tide, threatening to drown her. "You'll work it off one way or another," Raymond said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. The implication in his tone made her stomach twist. "Let go of her." The voice came from behind them, deep, gravelly, as if rarely used. Sarah turned to see a mountain of a man standing a few paces away. Emmett Sullivan. Everyone in Riverdale knew of him, though few could claim to know him. The reclusive rancher who'd struck gold in the hills and now owned the largest spread outside of town. The man who seldom spoke and never smiled. "This isn't your concern, Sullivan," Raymond spat, but his hand fell away from Sarah's shoulder. Emmett stepped closer, his broad frame casting a shadow between Sarah and Raymond. He didn't speak again, just stood there, steady as stone. "Fine." Raymond's eyes narrowed. "Take her if you want. She's a thief and a burden. I've given her more charity than she deserves." He leaned around Emmett to look at Sarah. "Remember, whatever debt you owe me doesn't just disappear because you found a new protector." With that, he turned and stalked away, the crowd parting before him like water. Only when Raymond had disappeared into the saloon did Sarah realize she'd been holding her breath. She released it in a shuddering exhale that turned to mist in the cold air. She swayed slightly, lightheaded from hunger and cold. Emmett's large hand steadied her elbow, his touch gentle despite his imposing presence. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed at her weakness. "I'll be fine now." Emmett didn't remove his hand. Instead, he studied her face with eyes the color of a winter sky. Gray and deep, not judging, but seeing, truly seeing her in a way that made Sarah want to shrink into herself. She knew what he would observe: hollow cheeks, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, hair that had once been her pride now limp and dull beneath her worn bonnet. Without a word, Emmett guided her toward a wagon loaded with supplies. Sarah resisted slightly. "I should go. I don't want to trouble." He shook his head once, cutting off her protest. Then, to her surprise, he led her to the passenger side of the wagon and helped her up as if she weighed nothing. The simple courtesy, being treated as a lady not a beggar, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. As Emmett walked around to the driver's side, Sarah heard whispers from the gathering crowd. "Sullivan's taking in strays again. What's he want with the widow Winters? That poor fool, doesn't he know she drove her husband to ruin?" The mute's got no sense when it comes to lost causes. Emmett climbed up beside her, seemingly deaf to the comments. He took the reins and clicked his tongue. The horses moved forward, pulling them away from the prying eyes of Riverdale. Only when the town had faded behind them did Sarah find her voice again. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't accept charity. I can work. I'll clean, cook, mend, anything you need." Emmett reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small slate and chalk. He wrote quickly, his large fingers surprisingly nimble with the small piece of chalk, then handed it to her. Not charity, just mercy. Sarah traced her fingers over the neat, precise handwriting, unexpected from such a rugged man. "You're not mute," she realized aloud. "You just choose not to speak." He nodded once, taking back the slate to write again. "Not broken, just quiet." Something about the simple dignity in those words touched Sarah deeply. She'd heard the rumors about Emmett Sullivan, that he'd returned from the war not right in the head, that he was simple or damaged. Looking at his clear, intelligent eyes and deliberate movements, she saw nothing broken in him. Just a man who carried silence like others carried conversation. They traveled another 3 miles up winding mountain roads before Emmett's ranch came into view. Sarah had expected grandeur, given his rumored wealth. Instead, she saw honest timber and stone, a modest but well-built main house with a wide porch, flanked by a barn and several outbuildings, all nestled against a backdrop of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth. Emmett brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He came around to offer his hand, but Sarah, pride flaring through exhaustion, managed to climb down on her own. Her legs nearly buckled when they touched solid ground. "I'll sleep in the barn," she said quickly. "I won't be beholden to any man." Emmett gave her a long look, then walked to the house without responding, leaving the door open behind him. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, torn between pride and the painful reality of her situation. The temperature was dropping with the sun, and she knew a night in the barn might well be her last. With reluctance, she followed him inside. The cabin smelled of a pine and coffee, clean in a way that spoke of care rather than servants. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light over simple, sturdy furniture. Emmett moved to a pot hanging over the fire and ladled something into a bowl. The scent of stew hit Sarah like a physical force, her stomach clenching painfully. How many days had it been since she'd eaten properly? 3, 4? Emmett set the bowl on the table, then moved to a door on the far wall and opened it. He gestured for her to look inside. A small room with a narrow bed covered in a hand-stitched quilt of deep blues and greens. Yellow wildflowers, preserved and pressed, hung in a frame on the wall. The room was plain but clean, with a small window overlooking the mountains. Emmett wrote on his slate again, "Rest, eat, tomorrow we talk." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist, to maintain some fragment of control. Instead, her body made the choice for her. She sank onto the chair before the stew, her hands trembling as she picked up the spoon. "Thank you," she whispered, the simple words wholly inadequate for the enormity of what she felt. Emmett nodded once and moved to sit in a chair by the fire, giving her space to eat without the discomfort of being watched. As Sarah took her first spoonful, she noticed a book in his lap, a Bible bound in worn leather, its edges soft from handling. He didn't open it, just rested his large hands atop the cover, his thumbs tracing the embossed title with a reverence that spoke of something beyond mere piety. She ate slowly, though her body screamed for her to devour the food. Her empty stomach could barely handle the rich stew, but each bite restored a little of her strength, a little of her humanity. When she finished, she carried the bowl to a wash basin near the stove, determined to at least clean up after herself. "I'll wash this," she said. Emmett shook his head and stood, taking the bowl gently from her hands. He gestured toward the small bedroom again, his meaning clear. Rest now. Alone in the small room, Sarah finally allowed herself to break. Tears came silently at first, then in shuddering sobs that she muffled against the pillow. The relief of safety, however temporary, overwhelmed her defenses. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had shown her simple kindness without demand or expectation. Thomas's voice echoed in her memory. "You eat when you've earned it. You sleep when I say you can. You're nothing without me, Sarah. Nothing." But the note had said, "Rest. Just rest. No demands, no threats." Outside the door, Emmett sat motionless by the fire, his fingers still tracing the letters on the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, names and places he couldn't decipher but had memorized by sound. The cabin settled into quiet, except for the crackle of flames and the distant call of an owl. Sarah pulled the quilt to her chin. Someone had made this with love and patience, each stitch even, the pattern thoughtful. She wondered who that person had been, and why Emmett lived alone in this clean, quiet house that seemed to wait for voices that never came. She fell asleep with questions circling her mind like crows. Dawn broke cold and clear. Sarah woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Memory rushed back. Raymond's threat, Emmett's intervention, the blessed relief of food and warmth. Guilt followed immediately. She'd slept in a stranger's home, accepted his charity, done nothing to earn her keep. She rose quickly, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress as best she could. Through the small window, she saw Emmett already outside, splitting wood with powerful rhythmic strokes. The morning light caught in his dark hair, revealing strands of silver at the temples. Sarah made the bed meticulously, then stepped into the main room. The fire had been built up again, and she noticed a pot of coffee on the stove, a cup set out beside it. On the table lay a plate with bread, butter, and preserves. Driven by years of hard survival, she ignored the food and headed straight outside. The crisp morning air burned her lungs, sharp and clean. Frost crunched under her boots as she approached Emmett. "I can help," she said, reaching for the axe. "I know how to split wood." Emmett caught her wrist, not roughly but firmly. He shook his head, then released her to retrieve his slate from his coat pocket. "Not yet." Anger flared hot in Sarah's chest. "I'm not a child. I can work." Emmett's expression remained impassive as he wrote again. "You ate one meal after days of hunger. Rest today. Work tomorrow." "I don't need your pity," Sarah said, the words sharper than she'd intended. Emmett studied her for a long moment, then wrote again, his letters more deliberate. "Not pity, respect. A starving horse can't pull a plow." The simple logic deflated her anger. He wasn't treating her as weak, just acknowledging reality. Still, the idea of sitting idle while he worked grated against everything she'd been taught. "At least let me cook," she said finally. "I can't just sit." He considered this, then nodded once. A compromise. Sarah returned to the house and found the kitchen well-stocked, but simply organized. She set to work making a proper breakfast, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar routine. By the time Emmett came inside, she had eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits waiting. They ate in companionable silence. After, Emmett cleared the table and pulled out his slate again. "Why does Raymond Blackwell think you owe him?" Sarah's hands stilled on the dishcloth she'd been using. She'd known this moment would come. The inevitable questions, the judgment that would follow. "My husband Thomas was a gambler," she began, the familiar shame washing over her. "He borrowed money from Raymond to cover his losses. When he died in a bar fight 6 months ago, Raymond claimed the debt fell to me." She swallowed hard. "The bank took our house and everything in it, but Raymond says that didn't cover what was owed." "How much?" $500. Emmett's eyebrows rose slightly. A fortune for most, especially a widow with nothing. "Did you sign anything?" "No, but the whole town believes I'm responsible. Thomas told everyone I drove him to gambling with my failings." The last word came out barely audible. Emmett's jaw tightened. He wrote again. "What failings?" Sarah looked away. "I couldn't give him children, and I used to play piano at church. Thomas said it was shameful, a wife drawing attention to herself that way." She unconsciously rubbed her left wrist, where the bones had once been broken. "He made sure I stopped." Understanding dawned in Emmett's eyes. He gently took her hand, turning it to examine the slight deformity in her wrist, the way the fingers didn't quite straighten. "He broke this?" Sarah nodded, pulling her hand back. "It's fine now, just a little stiff in the cold." Emmett's expression darkened. He wrote quickly, "A man who breaks what is beautiful deserves no loyalty." The unexpected defense brought heat to Sarah's cheeks. No one had ever suggested Thomas might have been wrong. The town had always seen him as the charming, troubled husband, and her as the frigid, unforgiving wife. "Why did you bring me here, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked directly. "What do you want from me?" Emmett considered her question, chalk hovering over slate. Finally he wrote, "I need help with something, not what you think." He stood and gestured for her to follow him to a small desk in the corner. From a drawer, he withdrew a sheaf of papers and spread them before her. Contracts, bills of sale, bank notices, all marked with an X where a signature should be. "I can't read," he wrote. "Can't write more than my mark. Need someone to teach me." Sarah stared at him in surprise. You want me to teach you to read?" He nodded, expression solemn. "But you're—" She gestured vaguely at their surroundings, at all he had built. "You've done so well without it. Found gold in a played-out claim everyone said was worthless. Made money. But I sign with an X and hope men are honest." He tapped one document in particular, a contract with terms so obviously predatory that Sarah winced reading it. "Are they honest?" he wrote. "No," Sarah admitted, "not all of them." "Will you teach me?" Sarah looked from the contracts to Emmett's face, seeing not just request but vulnerability. This powerful man was placing himself at her mercy, admitting a deficiency that many would mock or exploit. "Yes," she said, "I'll teach you." Relief softened his features. He wrote again. You teach me words, I give you shelter. No charity, a fair trade. Sarah felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. A sense that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't reached the end of her story after all. When do we start? Now, Emmett wrote. Then he reached beneath the desk and carefully lifted out an object wrapped in soft cloth. He unwrapped it with reverent hands to reveal the Bible she'd seen him holding the previous night. Your Bible? She asked. He nodded, then wrote, My mother's. She read it to me every night. She died 7 years ago. No one has read it to me since. The simple admission, the lonely image it conjured, touched something deep in Sarah's heart. She gently took the Bible, running her fingers over the worn cover. Let's begin with the alphabet, she said, reaching for the slate. Each letter makes a sound, and together they make words. As she began to write out the alphabet, Emmett watched with an intensity that made her throat tighten. He wasn't just going to try, he was going to pour himself into this effort completely. And somehow that mattered more than all the gold he'd pulled from the ground. The first lesson proved harder than Sarah had anticipated. Emmett struggled with the most basic letters, his frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw and the way his large hands clenched and unclenched. ABC, Sarah repeated patiently, pointing to each letter she'd written on the slate. Emmett stared at them as if they were enemy soldiers rather than simple marks. He shook his head and wrote, Can't remember which is which. They flip in my mind. Sarah considered this. Some people see letters differently. My father was the same way. Let's try another approach. She thought for a moment, then hummed a few notes. Do you know the alphabet song? Emmett shook his head. It's how children learn their letters. She cleared her throat, feeling strangely self-conscious, and began to sing softly, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, E, F. Her voice, unused to singing after so many years of silence, was hesitant at first, but as the simple melody continued, it grew stronger, filling the cabin with gentle music. Emmett sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, a strange expression crossed his features, something between wonder and pain. Sing it again, he wrote. Sarah complied, and this time Emmett's lips moved silently, following along. By the third repetition, he was nodding in time with the rhythm, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. My mother sang, he wrote afterward. I'd forgotten. Music helps us remember, Sarah said quietly. Let's try again tomorrow. Learning takes time. He nodded, then reached for his slate once more. Why did you stop playing piano? Sarah's hand unconsciously went to her wrist again. I told you Thomas didn't approve. He's dead. You're not. The blunt assessment caught her off guard. It's not that simple. I haven't played in years, and She looked down at her hands, at the slight crookedness of her fingers. I'm not sure I can anymore. Emmett studied her for a long moment, then wrote, Fear is a poor reason not to try. Before she could respond, he stood and walked to the door. He gestured outside, then wrote, Come, something to show you. Curious, Sarah followed him out the back door and along a narrow path that led to a small structure she hadn't noticed before, a workshop of sorts, set slightly apart from the main house. Emmett unlatched the door and led her inside. The space was filled with woodworking tools, neatly organized. Sawdust scented the air, mingling with the smell of linseed oil. But what caught Sarah's eye was the object in the center of the room, covered with a canvas drop cloth. Emmett crossed to it and hesitated, suddenly seeming unsure. Then with deliberate care, he pulled the cloth away. A piano. Not a grand instrument like the one at the church, but a small upright, its wood gleaming with fresh polish. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Where did you? She began, then stepped closer, drawn as if by an invisible thread. Her fingers hovered over the keys without touching them. Why do you have this? Emmett wrote on his slate, Mother played, I keep it tuned. May I? Sarah whispered, hardly daring to hope. He nodded, stepping back to give her space. Sarah sat on the bench, adjusting its height. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. Her left hand protested slightly, the old injury making itself known, but she ignored it. She began with a simple scale, notes rising and falling like water. The piano was indeed well-tuned, its voice warm and true. Emboldened, Sarah moved into a hymn, Amazing Grace, the first song she'd learned as a child. Her fingers stumbled occasionally, unused to the movement after so long. But the melody emerged clear and strong. She became so lost in the music that she almost forgot Emmett's presence until she heard a sharp intake of breath. She turned to find him standing rigid, his face pale. I'm sorry, she said quickly, pulling her hands away from the keys. Did I do something wrong? He shook his head, wrote hastily, my mother's favorite. Of course it would be. Sarah felt foolish for not considering how the music might affect him. I should have asked what you'd like to hear. No, please continue. His expression was so earnest, so open in its vulnerability, that Sarah couldn't refuse. She turned back to the keys and began again, this time letting the music flow more freely, adding the embellishments her father had taught her long ago. As she played, something inside her began to uncoil, a tension she'd carried for so long that she'd forgotten its weight. Her damaged wrist ached, but it was a clean pain, the kind that comes with healing rather than harm. When the final notes faded, Sarah realized her cheeks were wet with tears. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by the display of emotion. Emmett made no comment on her tears. Instead, he wrote, "Why did you stop playing?" "I told you," she began, but he shook his head firmly. "The real reason." Sarah looked down at the keys, trailing her fingers lightly over them without pressing. "Because every time I played, I remembered who I used to be, and it hurt too much to compare that girl to what I became." Emmett knelt beside the piano bench so that their eyes were level. He wrote carefully, making each letter precise. That girl is still here, just buried, like seeds in winter. The simple metaphor struck Sarah with unexpected force. Was it possible? Could parts of herself she thought dead simply be dormant, waiting for the right conditions to grow again? "I'm not sure I know how to find her," she admitted. "Start by playing, every day, not for me, for you." Sarah looked at him, the silent mountain of a man with gentle eyes, and felt something shift in her perception of him, of herself, of what might be possible in the shelter of this strange, quiet place he'd created. "I'll try," she promised. Emmett nodded once, satisfied. Then he wrote, "Dinner soon, you rest now." Despite her protests that she wasn't tired, Sarah found herself grateful for the chance to retreat to her room. The emotions stirred by the piano had left her feeling raw and exposed. She needed time to gather herself, to understand what had just happened between them. It wasn't until she was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, that she realized Emmett had given her something far more valuable than shelter or food. He'd given her permission to remember who she had been, and perhaps, someday, to become someone new entirely. Outside her window, the first heavy snowflakes of the season began to fall, blanketing the world in white silence. The days settled into a rhythm as October deepened toward November. Each morning, Sarah and Emmett would share a simple breakfast before he went out to tend the ranch. She insisted on handling household chores, unwilling to remain idle despite his protests. In the afternoons, they would sit at the kitchen table for reading lessons, the slate between them covered in chalky letters and simple words. Progress came slowly. Emmett's hands, so sure and steady when working with wood or handling animals, grew clumsy and tense when holding chalk. Letters shifted and reversed in his vision, a frustration evident in the deepening lines around his eyes. "House," Sarah said, pointing to the word she'd written, House. Emmett stared at the letters, his lips moving silently. After a long moment, he shook his head and wrote on his portion of the slate, "Looks like HSEUO to me." "That's all right," Sarah assured him. "Many people see letters differently. Let's try another way." She drew a simple house beside the word. "House, the word looks like this, and it means this." She tapped the drawing. "Try copying just the shape of the whole word, not letter by letter." Emmett tried again, his expression a study in concentration. His copy was shaky but recognizable. "Good," Sarah said, offering an encouraging smile. "Now close your eyes and picture the house in your mind. See its shape, its roof, its windows. Now, keeping that image, think of the word house as another picture, the picture of the sound the word makes." It was a technique her father had developed for himself, a man who'd struggled all his life with reading, yet had built a successful carpentry business through sheer determination. Emmett's eyes remained closed for nearly a minute. When he opened them, he wrote, "My father said I was too stupid to learn, said I was good for digging and lifting, nothing else." The admission, so plainly stated, made Sarah's chest ache. "Your father was wrong," she said firmly. "You're not stupid. Your mind just works differently than some. Mozart couldn't build a house, and I'd wager most carpenters can't compose a symphony." A ghost of a smile flickered across Emmett's face, the first she'd seen. It transformed him, softening the hard edges of his features. He wrote, "Not Mozart either." "You don't know that. Have you ever tried composing music?" Sarah teased gently. He shook his head, the almost smile lingering in his eyes if not on his lips. Then he wrote, "Let's try again." House. For an hour they worked, moving from house to barn to horse. By the end, Emmett could identify 5 words consistently. Not much, perhaps, but a beginning. When they finished, he wrote, "Thank you, tomorrow more." "Tomorrow more," Sarah agreed. "You're doing well, Mr. Sullivan." He wrote, "Emmett, not Mr. Sullivan." "Emmett," she amended, feeling a small thrill at the informality. "Then you must call me Sarah." He nodded, then hesitated before writing again. "Piano after dinner?" The question surprised her. She'd played several times since discovering the instrument in his workshop, but always alone when she thought Emmett was out tending to the ranch. The idea of playing for an audience, even an audience of one, awakened old anxieties. "I'm still quite rusty," she demurred. "I don't know good from bad, just like the music." His honesty disarmed her. "All right, after dinner." Satisfied, Emmett rose and gestured toward the stove, where a pot of stew had been simmering. As they prepared dinner together, moving around each other in the small kitchen, Sarah was struck by how comfortable their silence had become. With Thomas, silence had been dangerous, a prelude to rage or punishment. With Emmett, it felt like a language all its own, full of meaning and strangely intimate. After dinner and washing up, Emmett led the way to the workshop. The piano waited, its cover already lifted, a lamp lit beside it against the early darkness of autumn. Sarah sat at the bench and flexed her fingers, feeling the familiar twinge in her left wrist. "Any requests?" she asked. Emmett shook his head and settled into a chair a few feet away, giving her space to decide. She began with a hymn, the notes flowing more easily than they had the first time. Her damaged wrist still limited her dexterity, but she'd discovered ways to compensate, adapting passages that would have once been played with flourish into simpler, no less beautiful arrangements. When she finished, she glanced at Emmett and was startled to find his eyes closed, his head resting against the back of the chair. For a moment, she thought he'd fallen asleep, but then she noticed a tear tracking slowly down his weathered cheek. Sarah looked away quickly, not wanting to intrude on such a private moment. She turned back to the keys and began a lighter piece, a folk song her mother had taught her long ago. The evening passed in music and comfortable silence. When Sarah finally felt her hands tiring, she closed the piano gently. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me play. I didn't realize how much I missed it." Emmett opened his eyes and nodded. He wrote, "Music says what words can't." Coming from a man who chose not to speak, the observation carried particular weight. Sarah wondered, not for the first time, what had happened to make Emmett Sullivan retreat into silence. The following morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Emmett's axe splitting wood. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, intending to help with morning chores, only to find the yard covered in a pristine blanket of snow that had fallen overnight. The world had transformed while she slept, harsh edges softened by winter's first real offering. Emmett stood by the woodpile, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He nodded in greeting, then gestured toward the barn. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He shook his head, then beckoned to her to follow him. Inside the barn, warmth enveloped them, the scent of hay and horses, a comforting contrast to the bitter cold outside. Emmett led her to a stall where a mare had given birth overnight, her foal still damp and struggling to stand on spindly legs. "Oh," Sarah breathed, moving closer to the stall. "How beautiful." Emmett nodded, watching as the foal wobbled, fell, and determinedly tried again to rise. His expression held a tenderness that made Sarah's heart skip. This was a different kind of strength than the physical power that allowed him to split wood or lift heavy loads, a gentleness born of deep understanding and respect for life. She understood why he'd brought her here. Some moments needed to be witnessed, to be shared, even without words. They stayed until the foal managed to stand and find its mother's milk, a small miracle in the early morning light. As they walked back to the house, Sarah noticed something odd. Emmett was speaking, but not to her. He'd stopped a few paces behind, near a chestnut gelding in an outdoor paddock, and was murmuring to the animal in a low, gravelly voice. His words were indistinct, but the cadence was soothing, almost melodic. Sarah froze, not daring to turn around. Emmett Sullivan, the man who wrote rather than spoke, was talking to his horse. She moved on quickly, not wanting him to know she'd heard, but the revelation stayed with her. He wasn't mute. He chose not to speak to people, but with animals, he felt safe enough to use his voice. What had happened to make human conversation so impossible for him? Back in the house, Sarah busied herself with breakfast preparations, her mind still turning over what she'd witnessed. When Emmett returned, she gave no indication of what she'd heard, respecting the boundary he'd established. After breakfast, Sarah decided to tackle the mending pile she'd noticed in a basket near the fireplace. As she worked, she glanced occasionally at Emmett, who sat at his desk reviewing what appeared to be ranch accounts. His brow furrowed as he compared figures, making simple marks to track totals. "Would you like help with those?" she offered. "I used to keep the books for my father's carpentry business." Emmett looked up, relief evident in his expression. He nodded and gestured for her to join him. The accounts were surprisingly complex for a man who couldn't read. He developed his own system of symbols to track expenses, income, and inventory. It was ingenious in its way, but inefficient and easy to mistake. "You're quite clever to manage all this," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. "But I think we can make it simpler." Together, they worked out a new system, combining Emmett's symbols with proper numbers and basic words he could learn to recognize. By lunchtime, they'd reorganized a month's worth of records. "There," Sarah said, setting down her pencil. "Now you can see at a glance how the ranch is performing." Emmett studied the new ledger, nodding slowly. He wrote, "Clearer now, thank you." "You're welcome. It's the least I can do, considering your kindness to me." He shook his head and wrote, "Not kindness, fair exchange." Sarah smiled. "Is that why you keep insisting I rest and recover? For this fair exchange?" For a moment, she thought she'd overstepped, but then a hint of that almost smile touched his lips again. He wrote, "Caught me. Selfish motives all along." The attempt at humor, however slight, warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. This taciturn man was slowly revealing layers she hadn't expected. Intelligence, gentleness, and now a subtle wit. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself watching Emmett more closely, cataloging the small tells that communicated what his voice did not. The slight crease between his brows when he concentrated, the way his eyes softened when they rested on something beautiful, the careful precision with which he handled fragile objects. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room. Sarah took up her mending again, while Emmett worked on a piece of wood, carving what appeared to be a small animal. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the flecks of silver in his dark hair. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Emmett set down his carving and reached for the slate. 7 years, after the war." "The war?" Sarah hesitated, unsure if she should press. "Were you a soldier? Army doctor? Field surgeon?" The answer surprised her. She'd assumed, given his size and strength, that he'd been a fighting man. "That's an honorable profession." Emmett's expression darkened. He wrote slowly, "Nothing honorable about watching boys die while you stand in their blood." The raw pain in those words silenced any response Sarah might have made. She returned to her mending, giving him space to wrestle with whatever memories she'd unintentionally awakened. After a while, Emmett wrote again, "I'm sorry, some ghosts don't rest easy." "You don't need to apologize," Sarah said softly. "We all carry things we wish we could put down." He studied her face for a long moment, then wrote, "What do you carry, Sarah Winters?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands, at the slight bend in her fingers where they hadn't healed properly. "Failure," she admitted, the word barely above a whisper. "I failed to be the wife Thomas wanted. I failed to stand up to him when he began gambling away our savings. I failed to stop him the night he died, when he was so drunk he could barely stand but insisted on going to that card game." She swallowed hard. "And when they brought his body home, I felt relief." What kind of woman feels relief at her husband's death? Emmett's chalk moved across the slate. A woman who was prisoner, not wife. Relief is not wrong. "The town doesn't see it that way. They think I drove him to drink, to gambling, that his debts are my burden to bear." The town is wrong. 3 simple words, yet they landed with the weight of absolution. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them away. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me." He nodded once, then returned to his carving. The conversation was over, but something had shifted between them, a deepening of trust, a recognition of shared wounds. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she realized with a start that she'd been at Emmett's ranch for nearly 2 weeks. The time had passed so naturally that she'd scarcely noticed its passage. More surprising still was the realization that, for the first time in years, she felt safe. Not just physically, but in the quiet acceptance Emmett offered without demand or judgment. It was dangerous, this growing comfort. Raymond Blackwell hadn't forgotten her, and sooner or later, she would have to face him again. But for tonight in this snow-hushed sanctuary, Sarah allowed herself to believe that things might somehow work out. She was drifting to sleep when a sound pulled her back to consciousness, a cry, sharp and pained, from somewhere in the house. Sarah sat up listening. It came again, a raw sound of anguish. Emmett! Without stopping to think, she grabbed her shawl and hurried to his room across the hall. The door stood ajar, lamplight spilling into the corridor. Inside, Emmett thrashed on his bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. His face was contorted, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's chill. Daniel, no, he moaned, the words thick with sleep and terror. Hold on, don't. Sarah hesitated at the threshold. This was intensely private, and Emmett might not welcome her intrusion. But she couldn't leave him trapped in whatever horror he was reliving. Emmett, she called softly, then louder when he didn't respond. Emmett, wake up. It's just a dream. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. For a terrifying moment, he didn't seem to recognize her. Then awareness returned, followed immediately by shame. He sat up, turning away from her, his shoulders rigid with tension. I'm sorry, Sarah said. I was worried. Emmett reached for the slate kept by his bedside, but his hands were shaking too badly to write. He set it down, visibly struggling to compose himself. You don't have to explain, Sarah said gently. We all have nightmares. He shook his head, jaw clenched. After a moment, he tried writing again. You should go. Are you sure? I could make some tea. Please. The plea was clear. He needed solitude to rebuild his defenses, to tuck away whatever demons had broken through in sleep. Sarah nodded and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Back in her room, she lay awake, listening. No more sounds came from across the hall, but she knew sleep wouldn't return easily for either of them now. Daniel. The name Emmett had called out in his nightmare. Who was he? A patient lost during the war, a friend? The anguish in Emmett's voice suggested someone far closer than a random soldier. Sarah resolved to be kinder, more patient tomorrow. Whatever battle Emmett fought in his dreams was clearly far from over. Morning arrived with more snow and a biting wind that rattled the windows. Sarah found Emmett already in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. If he'd slept at all after his nightmare, it didn't show in the shadows beneath his eyes or the tightness around his mouth. Good morning, she said, careful to keep her tone normal, not wanting to embarrass him with references to the night before. He nodded in greeting, then wrote on his slate, Going to town today. Need supplies before storm comes. Sarah tensed. Town meant Raymond Blackwell, curious eyes, whispered judgment. I can stay here, she offered quickly. Emmett shook his head. Need your help, reading labels, choosing supplies. It was a reasonable request, and Sarah couldn't refuse after all Emmett had done for her. Besides, she'd have to face Riverdale eventually. Better to do it with Emmett at her side than alone. Of course, she agreed, trying to sound more confident than she felt. When do we leave? After breakfast. Dress warmly. The journey to town took longer than usual, the wagon moving cautiously along snow-covered roads. Sarah sat huddled beneath a buffalo robe Emmett had provided, grateful for its warmth. The landscape had been transformed by winter, familiar landmarks rendered strange and beautiful beneath their white cloaks. As they approached Riverdale, Sarah's anxiety mounted. 2 weeks ago, she'd been destitute, desperate, at the mercy of Raymond Blackwell's threats. Now she returned in a wagon beside Emmett Sullivan, clean and well-fed, wearing a coat he'd insisted she take from a trunk of what she assumed were his mother's belongings. What would people think? What would they say? The town came into view, smoke rising from chimneys, streets already busy despite the weather. Emmett guided the wagon to a hitching post outside the general store, then came around to help Sarah down. She took his hand, steadying herself on the slippery ground. Mr. Sullivan, didn't expect to see you in town today. The greeting came from Sheriff Miller, a graying man with kind eyes who'd always treated Sarah fairly, even after Thomas's death. Emmett nodded in acknowledgement. And Mrs. Winters, the sheriff continued, tipping his hat to Sarah. Good to see you looking well. Heard you were staying out at the Sullivan place. News traveled fast in small towns. Mr. Sullivan has been kind enough to employ me, Sarah said, the half-truth coming easily. That's so? Well, good for both of you. The sheriff's gaze moved between them, assessing but not judgmental. Weather's turning bad. Might want to finish your business and head back before it hits. We'll be quick, Sarah assured him. Thank you, Sheriff. Inside the general store, warmth enveloped them, along with the mingled scents of coffee, tobacco, and spices. Mrs. Porter, the owner's wife, looked up from her ledger, surprise registering on her round face at the sight of them together. Mrs. Winters, Mr. Sullivan, she greeted, her tone carefully neutral. What can I help you with today? Emmett handed Sarah a list he'd prepared. She read it aloud. Coffee, sugar, flour, salt, matches, lamp oil, and… She glanced at Emmett, who nodded encouragingly. And some peppermint candy if you have it. Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose at the last item, but she set about gathering their supplies without comment. Sarah helped, reading labels and comparing prices as Emmett had asked, conscious of the curious glances from the other customers. They were nearly finished when the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Sarah didn't need to turn to know who it was. The sudden stillness in the store, the way Emmett's shoulders tensed beside her, told her everything. Well, well, Raymond Blackwell's voice sliced through the quiet. If it isn't the widow Winters and her benefactor. Sarah forced herself to turn to meet his gaze directly. Raymond stood just inside the entrance, snow melting on the shoulders of his expensive coat. His handsome face wore an expression of calculated amusement. Mr. Blackwell, she acknowledged, proud of how steady her voice sounded. I was beginning to think you'd left town for good, Raymond said, moving closer. But here you are, shopping like a proper lady. Has Sullivan here paid off your debts then? Or have you found another way to settle them? The insinuation hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. But before she could respond, Emmett stepped between them. His expression remained impassive, but something in his stance had changed. A subtle shift from quiet strength to coiled threat. Raymond's smile faltered slightly. No need for dramatics, Sullivan, just a friendly inquiry about a financial matter. Emmett didn't move or speak, just held Raymond's gaze until the younger man looked away first. We should discuss your husband's debt sometime soon, Mrs. Winters, Raymond said, his tone hardening. My father's patience isn't unlimited, even for old friends like Sullivan. With that, he tipped his hat mockingly and moved to the counter, effectively dismissing them. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered their purchases. She felt the weight of stares from every corner of the store. Mrs. Porter's tight-lipped disapproval, the avid curiosity of other customers, Emmett's concerned glance. From near the dry goods shelves, Hannah Wallace, the pastor's wife, watched the exchange with troubled eyes, quickly looking away when Sarah glanced in her direction. Unlike the others, her expression held not judgment, but something closer to sympathy, and perhaps guilt. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow in horizontal sheets. Emmett loaded their supplies quickly, then helped Sarah up to the wagon seat. Only when they'd left the town behind did Sarah's breathing steady, her pulse slow to normal. I'm sorry, she said finally. Raymond has always been difficult, but he seems to have a particular dislike for you. Emmett pulled the wagon to a stop and reached for his slate. Not your fault. Raymond Blackwell and I have history. What kind of history? His father, the mayor, was kind to me when I first came here. Raymond resented it, thought I was using his family's connections. Sarah considered this. Were you using their connections, I mean? Emmett's expression softened slightly, appreciating her direct question. No, just needed help with paperwork for the ranch. Thomas Blackwell, the mayor, offered. His son didn't approve. And now Raymond thinks I'm using you, Sarah said, understanding dawning. He sees it as a pattern, people taking advantage of the Sullivan wealth. Emmett nodded, then wrote, let him think what he wants. Truth matters more than gossip. The simple declaration should have been comforting, but Sarah knew better than most how gossip could destroy lives, especially in a small town like Riverdale. She'd watched her own reputation crumble after Thomas's death, helpless against the tide of whispers and judgment. Truth doesn't always win, she said softly. Emmett studied her face for a long moment, then wrote, then we make it win. The confidence in those words, the steady certainty behind them, warmed something cold and fearful in Sarah's heart. She nodded, finding a small smile despite her lingering anxiety. They continued homeward as the storm intensified, snow swirling around them like a living thing. By the time they reached the ranch, the world had disappeared into a howling white void. Emmett's capable hands guided the horses to the barn through memory alone, the path invisible beneath the drifting snow. Inside the house, a fire still burned in the hearth, a welcome beacon against the gathering storm. Sarah removed her wet coat and boots, gratitude for this refuge washing over her anew. It wasn't just shelter from the physical storm, but from the tempest of judgment and cruelty she'd faced in town. I'll make some tea, she offered, needing the comfort of routine. Emmett nodded, moving to stoke the fire higher. As Sarah prepared the tea, she watched him from the corner of her eye, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet competence that seemed to define him. In just 2 weeks, she'd come to rely on his steady presence in ways that both comforted and terrified her. Reliance meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had always led to pain in her experience. Yet Emmett had shown her nothing but respect and kindness, asking for nothing beyond her help with reading. No demands, no threats, no subtle manipulations. It was so unlike her marriage that Sarah hardly knew how to navigate it. Here, she said, bringing him a steaming cup. Their fingers brushed as he took it, a brief contact that sent an unexpected shiver up her arm. Emmett noticed, misinterpreting it as cold. He gestured toward the fire, encouraging her to sit closer to its warmth. Sarah obeyed, settling into a chair and wrapping her hands around her own cup. For a time, they sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm rage outside. It was Emmett who finally broke the quiet, reaching for his slate. "You played piano at church before." It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. "Since I was a girl, my father built the church's piano." The memory brought a sad smile to her lips. He couldn't play a note, but he loved listening to me practice. "What happened to your father?" "He died when I was 16, influenza. Even after all these years, the loss still ached. My mother had passed years before, so I was alone. That's when I married Thomas. He seemed kind then, protective." Emmett's expression darkened. He wrote, "When did he change?" "After we'd been married about a year. It started small, criticism, then control, then—" She gestured vaguely toward her wrist. "He was careful, though, never marked where people could see." Emmett's hand clenched around the chalk, nearly snapping it. He took a deep breath before writing, "I'm sorry that happened to you." "It's in the past now," Sarah said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The past had a way of lingering, of shaping the present in subtle and obvious ways. Her damaged wrist, her fear of Raymond, her instinctive flinch at sudden movements, all echoes of what Thomas had done to her. "Would you play? Now, storm makes the house too quiet." The request surprised her, but Sarah found herself nodding. "Let me just get a shawl. The workshop will be cold." Emmett shook his head and rose, gesturing for her to wait. He disappeared down the hall, returning moments later with something large and cloth-covered. With careful movements, he set it down near the fire and removed the covering. The piano from the workshop. Somehow, while she'd been preparing tea, he'd moved it into the main room. The feat of strength required to carry such a heavy instrument alone was staggering. "Emmett," Sarah breathed, "you shouldn't have. You're back." He waved away her concern, writing, "Worth it. Music should be where living happens, not hidden away." There was something so poignant in those words, something that spoke to wounds far deeper than physical strain. Sarah moved to the piano, running her fingers over the polished wood. "What would you like to hear?" "Whatever brings you joy to play." Such a simple request, yet so profound in its generosity. Sarah sat at the bench and began with a cheerful folk tune, one her father had loved. The melody danced above the howl of the wind, filling the cabin with warmth beyond what the fire could provide. As she played, Sarah glanced occasionally at Emmett. He'd settled back into his chair, eyes closed, tension gradually easing from his features. When she finished the first piece, she moved smoothly into another, then another, losing track of time in the flow of music. Eventually, her hands tired, and she ended with a gentle lullaby. As the final notes faded, she turned to find Emmett watching her, his expression so open and vulnerable that it caught her breath. He wrote, "Beautiful, like sunshine through stained glass." The unexpected poetry of his description touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly, "for bringing the piano in, for listening." He nodded, then wrote, "We should sleep. Storm will need shoveling tomorrow." The reminder of practical concerns broke the spell of the moment. Sarah rose from the bench, suddenly aware of how intimate the evening had felt, sitting by firelight playing music just for him. "Good night, Emmett," she said, moving toward her room. "And thank you again." He wrote quickly, "Thank you, Sarah, for the music, for today." She smiled and slipped into her room, closing the door softly behind her. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but within her chest, something warm and frightening was taking root, a feeling she'd thought long dead, buried beneath years of fear and pain. Hope. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through her window, the storm having blown itself out overnight. She dressed quickly and found Emmett already outside, clearing paths through snow that reached past his knees in places. He worked methodically, his breath clouding in the frigid air, shoulders moving powerfully beneath his heavy coat. She watched him for a moment, struck by the contrast between his physical strength and the gentleness he'd shown her. In her experience, strong men use their power to control, to intimidate. Emmett used his to protect, to build, to make music possible on a stormy night. The realization unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name. Pulling on her coat and boots, Sarah joined him outside, taking up a second shovel without asking permission. Emmett glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "I'm not made of glass," she said in response to his unspoken concern. "I can help." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, conceding the point. They worked together, clearing a path to the barn first, then to the workshop and woodpile. The labor was hard but satisfying, the clean air and physical effort invigorating after being cooped up during the storm. When they finished, Emmett gestured toward a hill behind the house, then mimed sliding down it. "Sledding?" Sarah asked, surprised by the playful suggestion. He nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners in what she was learning to recognize as his version of a smile. "I haven't been sledding since I was a girl," she admitted. Emmett raised an eyebrow in mock horror, then wrote on his slate, "A tragedy that must be remedied immediately." Before she could protest, he disappeared into the barn, returning moments later with a simple wooden sled. He gestured toward the hill with an expectant look. "You can't be serious," Sarah laughed. "We're grown adults." Precisely why we need to remember how to play. The logic was so earnest, so endearingly simple, that Sarah couldn't refuse. "One ride," she conceded, "then we should really see to the animals." One ride became two, then three. Laughter bubbling up from some long-forgotten place inside her as they took turns sliding down the hill. Emmett's rare, full smile transformed his face entirely, erasing years of solemnity and worry. On their final run, the sled hit a bump, sending them both tumbling into a snowdrift. Sarah emerged sputtering, snow in her hair and down her collar, to find Emmett looking equally undignified. Their eyes met, and suddenly they were both laughing, Sarah aloud, Emmett in silent shakes that nonetheless conveyed pure joy. It was, Sarah realized, the first time she'd laughed, truly laughed, in years. As they trudged back to the house, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion, Sarah felt lighter somehow, as if the snow and laughter had washed away some of the heaviness she'd carried for so long. They spent the afternoon in companionable productivity, Sarah baking bread while Emmett repaired a broken chair. As dusk approached, Sarah decided to check a storage closet for extra blankets, the temperature dropping rapidly with the setting sun. The closet was near Emmett's room, filled with household essentials. As she sorted through linens, Sarah's hand brushed against something solid at the back of a shelf. Curious, she pulled it forward. A wooden box, simply but beautifully made, with a caduceus, the medical symbol of intertwined snakes, carved into its lid. A doctor's kit. Sarah knew she should have put it back. This was clearly private, perhaps painful given what Emmett had revealed about his time as a field surgeon. But something compelled her to open it, to understand more about the silent man who had shown her such kindness. Inside lay an assortment of medical instruments, meticulously maintained despite obvious age and use. Beneath them, wrapped in cloth, she found a book. Not a Bible or ledger, but a journal. Opening it, Sarah discovered not written entries, but drawings, detailed, skillful renderings of wounds, surgical procedures, human anatomy. The illustrations were clinical, but somehow deeply compassionate, each accompanied by symbols she couldn't decipher, but recognized as Emmett's personal notation system. Many pages showed the same young man in various stages of treatment, his face rendered with particular care and attention. "Oh," Sarah breathed, understanding dawning. This wasn't just a random patient. The resemblance to Emmett was unmistakable. Same jawline, same eyes, though younger and lacking the weathered quality of Emmett's features. The final pages showed the young man's condition deteriorating, the drawings becoming more desperate, more frantically detailed. The last illustration showed only a hand, limp and still, with a simple cross drawn beside it. Sarah closed the journal, heart aching for what it revealed. Emmett had lost someone during the war, someone who looked like him, who might have been family, a brother perhaps, and he documented every step of trying and failing to save him. No wonder he chose silence. What words could possibly follow such a loss? She carefully replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, taking the blankets she'd come for and quietly closing the closet. As she turned, she found Emmett standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. How long he'd been there, whether he'd seen her with his box, she couldn't tell. "I found some extra blankets," she said, voice carefully neutral. "The temperature's dropping quickly." He nodded and stepped aside to let her pass, giving no indication that he'd noticed anything amiss. But as Sarah moved past him, she felt the weight of unspoken knowledge between them, another layer added to their complex, fragile connection. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Sarah found herself watching Emmett more closely, seeing him through the lens of what she'd discovered. The way he absently rubbed his right hand, as if phantom blood still stained it. The distant look that sometimes crossed his features when he stared into the fire. The careful precision with which he handled fragile things, like a man who knew intimately how easily life could break. She wanted to ask about the journal, about the young man who looked so much like him. But such a question would require admitting she'd pried into his private things and might shatter the trust they'd built. Instead, she said, "Would you like to try reading from your mother's Bible tonight? We could start with something simple." Emmett considered her offer, then nodded. He retrieved the Bible from its shelf, handling it with reverent care, and brought it to where they sat. Sarah opened to Psalm 23, one of the shortest and most familiar passages. "Let's try this one," she suggested. "I'll read it once, then we'll go through it together." She read slowly, clearly. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." As her voice fills the quiet room, Sarah noticed Emmett's lips moving silently, following along from memory. When she finished, she pointed to the first line. "Try reading this aloud," she encouraged gently. "Just the first line." Emmett stared at the text, his expression a complex mixture of determination and fear. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. After a moment, he shook his head and reached for his slate. "Can't, not yet." "That's all right," Sarah assured him. "We can keep working on recognizing the words silently. Speaking them will come when you're ready." Relief softened his features. He wrote, "Thank you for not pushing." "We all have our own pace," she said simply. "For some things, I'm still learning to walk when others run." They spent an hour with the Bible, Sarah reading passages aloud while Emmett followed along, occasionally stopping to identify words he recognized. His progress was slow but steady, his determination unwavering, despite the obvious difficulty. When they finally closed the book, Emmett wrote, "Better with your help. Tried alone for years. Never got this far." "Sometimes we need another person's eyes to see clearly," Sarah said. "My father used to say that." "Your father was wise." "Yes," she agreed softly, "he was." As Sarah prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of her father, his patient hands teaching her to play piano, his quiet strength, his unfailing kindness. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge how much Emmett reminded her of him, not in appearance or circumstances, but in the steady core of decency that defined both men. It was a dangerous comparison. Her father had been safety, home, unconditional love. Emmett was, what? A temporary sanctuary, a fragile friendship, something she dared not name even to herself? Sarah closed her door and leaned against it, heart racing with unwelcome realizations. Whatever was growing between them, this delicate, unnamed thing, frightened her far more than Raymond Blackwell's threats or the town's judgment ever could. Because, for the first time since Thomas had shown her the true cost of vulnerability, Sarah found herself wanting to trust again. The following week brought a thaw, not just in the weather as temperatures rose enough to melt some of the accumulated snow, but in Sarah and Emmett's relationship as well. Their routine had evolved into something comfortable yet charged with unspoken possibilities. Each morning they shared breakfast and chores. Afternoons were devoted to reading lessons that now included simple sentences Emmett could recognize and understand. Evenings brought music and quiet companionship by the fire. Sarah found herself watching Emmett more often, noticing details she'd missed before, the way sunlight caught the silver at his temples, how his hands, calloused and strong, could be impossibly gentle when handling a newborn lamb or turning the fragile pages of his mother's Bible. The rare, transformative smile that appeared more frequently now, like a shy creature gradually gaining courage to emerge from hiding. For his part, Emmett seemed more relaxed in her presence, less guarded. He'd taken to leaving small gifts for her to find. Wildflower honey from a neighbor's hives, a wooden comb he'd carved himself, a worn copy of poetry he'd discovered in town. Each offering was presented without ceremony or expectation, just quiet tokens of appreciation, friendship, something more? Sarah dared not name it, even to herself. One afternoon, as Emmett worked outside repairing a fence damaged in the storm, Sarah decided to tackle the disorganized bookshelves in his study. Though he owned surprisingly many books for a man who couldn't read, they were haphazardly arranged, many gathering dust from disuse. She was halfway through the task, humming softly as she worked, when a knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare at the Sullivan Ranch, especially in winter. Sarah smoothed her apron and hair before answering, wondering who would brave the muddy, half-frozen roads. The man on the porch was unfamiliar, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His expensive coat and polished boots marked him as a person of means. "Good afternoon," he said, removing his hat. "I'm looking for Emmett Sullivan." "He's working on the south pasture," Sarah replied. "May I tell him who's calling?" "Thomas Blackwell, mayor of Riverdale." His keen eyes assessed her. "And you must be Mrs. Winters." Sarah tensed at the name, Raymond's father. "Yes, sir." "May I come in? It's rather cold out here." Reluctantly, Sarah stepped aside. She couldn't very well leave the mayor standing on the porch, yet she was acutely aware of being alone with Raymond's father, a man whose opinion of her had likely been poisoned by his son's accounts. "I'll make some tea," she offered, falling back on the social niceties her mother had taught her long ago. "Thank you." Mayor Blackwell settled into a chair by the fire, looking around the cabin with interest. "Sullivan's place has changed since I was last here. Feels more lived in." Sarah busied herself with the kettle, unsure how to respond. When she returned with tea, the mayor accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "I understand you're teaching Emmett to read," he said without preamble. Sarah nearly spilled her own tea. "How did you know that?" "Small towns have few secrets, Mrs. Winters. And I've known Emmett since he arrived in Riverdale 7 years ago. I helped him purchase this land, navigate the legal matters he couldn't manage alone." Understanding dawned. "You're the one who assisted him with the paperwork." Mayor Blackwell nodded. "Emmett saved my wife's life during the war. She was volunteering as a nurse when typhoid swept through the camp. He recognized her symptoms before anyone else and isolated her, treated her personally. I owed him a debt I could never repay." His expression grew pensive. "So when he arrived here, unable or unwilling to speak, I did what I could to help." Sarah absorbed this new information, reassessing her understanding of the situation. "Your son seems less appreciative of Mr. Sullivan." "Raymond has his own perspectives," the mayor said diplomatically. "But I didn't come here to discuss my son. I came because the bank has raised some concerns about Emmett's accounts." "What concerns?" Sarah asked, immediately alert. "Irregularities, withdrawals that don't match Emmett's usual patterns, investments made in his name that seem uncharacteristic." He studied Sarah's face. "The bank manager approached me as a courtesy, given my history with Emmett. He was concerned that someone might be taking advantage." The implication was clear. Sarah set down her cup, anger flaring. "You think I'm stealing from him? I think Emmett Sullivan is a wealthy man who cannot read contracts or bank statements, and who now has a woman with significant debts living in his home." Mayor Blackwell's tone remained even, but his gaze was sharp. "You can understand how that might appear." "I've done nothing wrong," Sarah said firmly. "I've been helping Emmett understand his accounts, that's all." "I believe you," the mayor said, surprising her. "But I also believe someone is manipulating Emmett's finances, and has been for some time." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Mayor Blackwell reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "This arrived at my office yesterday. It's a notice of foreclosure on this ranch, citing outstanding loans Emmett supposedly took against the property." "That's impossible," Sarah said, taking the paper. "Emmett owns this land outright. He paid cash from his gold claim." She scanned the document, dismay growing as she read. "This says he borrowed against the property 6 months ago and has missed 3 payments." "Exactly. Does that sound like something Emmett would do?" "No." Sarah's mind raced. "He keeps meticulous records of his expenses. I've seen them. There's no loan, no missed payments." "Then someone forged his mark," Mayor Blackwell said grimly. "And I think we both have an idea who that might be." "Raymond." "It had to be, but how and why?" "This document says the loan came from First Bank of Riverdale." "Isn't that where your son works?" The mayor's expression tightened. "Yes, it is." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Raymond had falsified loan documents, used his position at the bank to forge Emmett's mark, It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Have you spoken to Raymond about this? Sarah asked. Not yet. I wanted to see Emmett first, confirm that he never took such a loan. Mayor Blackwell looked troubled. If my son has done what I suspect, there will be consequences. But I need to be certain. The sound of boots on the perch announced Emmett's return. He entered, stopping short at the sight of the mayor seated by his fire. His questioning gaze moved to Sarah. Mayor Blackwell came to discuss a financial matter, she explained, rising to hand him the document. Apparently there's a foreclosure notice on the ranch. Emmett's brow furrowed as he examined the paper. After a moment, he shook his head emphatically and reached for his slate. Never borrowed against property. Never signed this. I didn't think so, Mayor Blackwell said, standing to greet him properly. But someone wants the bank, and me, to believe you did. Emmett's expression darkened. He wrote quickly. Raymond? Possibly. The mayor sighed heavily. There have been irregularities at the bank lately. Nothing I could prove, but enough to worry me. If Raymond is involved. He left the sentence unfinished, the pain of a father confronting his son's possible betrayal evident in his lined face. What happens now? Emmett wrote. I'll speak with the bank president. Show him that your mark was forged. The foreclosure will be withdrawn. Mayor Blackwell's expression grew grimmer. And I'll deal with Raymond if he's involved. Sarah remembered Raymond's threat in town, his mention of his father's patience. Had he known even then that the mayor was growing suspicious of his activities? There's something else, she said, making a decision. When we were in town last week, Raymond mentioned Thomas's gambling debts, the ones he claims I inherited. He was particularly insistent about collecting them soon. The mayor frowned. Thomas's debts? I wasn't aware Raymond had personally lent money to your husband. Neither was I, until after Thomas died. Sarah twisted her hands in her apron. But Raymond produced notes with Thomas's signature, claiming he owed $500 for gambling losses. May I see these notes? I don't have them. Raymond kept them, said they were legal documents I couldn't be trusted with. Mayor Blackwell's frown deepened. That's highly irregular. Debt notes should be surrendered upon payment, or at least copies provided to the debtor. Then you think they might also be… Sarah couldn't finish the thought. Forgeries? It's possible. Mayor Blackwell looked genuinely troubled. Thomas had his faults, Mrs. Winters, but he was an educated man who knew better than to sign unsecured notes for gambling debts. And while Raymond has authority at the bank, he doesn't have personal wealth to lend such sums. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Raymond had fabricated the debt, if Thomas had never actually borrowed that money, she'd been living in fear, facing the town's judgment for nothing. Emmett moved to stand beside her, his solid presence steadying. He wrote on his slate, "We'll prove it. Together." Mayor Blackwell nodded in agreement. "I'll investigate both matters. If Raymond has been engaging in fraud, he'll answer for it, son or no." He collected his hat. "In the meantime, don't worry about the foreclosure. I'll handle it." As he prepared to leave, the mayor paused. "Mrs. Wallace approached me yesterday quite distressed. She mentioned seeing Raymond speaking to you in ways that troubled her. I believe she may know more than she's let on." He sighed. "Fear keeps many tongues still in our town, I'm afraid." Emmett walked the mayor out, returning to find Sarah still standing by the fire, document clutched in her hands. "All this time," she murmured, "I've been afraid, ashamed, believing I was responsible for Thomas's debts. If Raymond made it all up." She looked up at Emmett, anger replacing shock. "Why would he do this? What does he gain?" Emmett took the slate. Power, control. Seeing you afraid gave him both. The simple assessment rang true. Raymond had always enjoyed wielding power over others, especially those he considered beneath him. A widow with no family, no resources. What better target for his manipulations? "And now he's targeting you," Sarah said. "Why?" "Land. My ranch borders his father's property. Good water access. He's tried to buy it before. So he creates a false debt, then forecloses when you can't pay." Sarah shook her head in disgust. "It's despicable." "It's finished," Emmett wrote. "Mayor will stop him." Sarah wished she shared his confidence. Men like Raymond rarely surrendered easily, especially when cornered. "We should be careful," she warned. "Raymond won't take this well when he's exposed." Emmett nodded, his expression serious. Then he wrote, "Don't worry about tomorrow's troubles. Today has enough." The gentle wisdom of the words, echoing scripture, brought a small smile to Sarah's lips despite her concerns. "You're right, and today we were supposed to continue your reading lesson." They settled at the kitchen table, forcing their attention back to simpler matters. But as they worked, a new awareness hummed between them, the sense that they stood together now against whatever came next, united in purpose beyond their initial arrangement. That night, after Emmett had retired to his room, Sarah sat alone by the dying fire, turning over the day's revelations. If Raymond had falsified both Emmett's loan and Thomas's gambling debts, her entire understanding of the past 6 months shifted. She wasn't a debtor, a burden, a failure. She was a victim of Raymond's schemes and the town's willingness to believe the worst of her. The realization brought both liberation and rage. How much suffering had she endured because of one man's greed? How much shame had she carried unnecessarily? A soft sound pulled her from these thoughts. A muffled cry from Emmett's room. Another nightmare. Without hesitation, Sarah rose and moved down the hall. This time, she didn't saw him at the threshold but entered, finding Emmett thrashing against his sheets, face contorted in silent agony. "Emmett," she called gently, then again more firmly when he didn't respond. "Emmett, wake up." His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by the now familiar shame. He turned away, reaching for the slate by his bed. Sarah stopped his hand. "No," she said softly. "You don't need to write anything. You don't need to explain." She sat carefully on the edge of the bed, close but not touching him. "When Thomas died, I had nightmares every night. I'd see his face, hear his accusations, feel his hands." She swallowed hard. "What I'm trying to say is, I understand. Maybe not what you're dreaming, but what it's like to be haunted." Emmett's breathing steadied. After a long moment, he reached for the slate anyway. But what he wrote surprised her. "Daniel was my brother, younger by 6 years." Sarah's heart clenched, remembering the journal drawings, the young man who resembled Emmett. "He was in the war?" Emmett nodded, grief etching new lines in his face as he wrote, "Joined against my wishes, followed me to battlefield. Gut shot at Gettysburg, couldn't save him." The stark, simple sentences conveyed a world of agony. Sarah thought of her glimpse of the journal, the increasingly desperate medical illustrations as Daniel's condition worsened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were wholly inadequate. "Talked for hours while he died, promised everything would be all right. Lied to my own brother as he bled out in my hands." Emmett's writing grew shaky, his hand trembling. Last words were lies. What good are words after that? Understanding bloomed in Sarah's heart. Emmett's silence wasn't stubbornness or damage, it was penance. Atonement for what he saw as his greatest failure. "Oh, Emmett," she said, her voice breaking. Without thinking, she reached out, covering his hand with her own. "You didn't lie to comfort him. You gave him hope in his final moments. That's not a sin, it's mercy." He shook his head, unconvinced, but he didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, he turned his hand beneath hers until their palms met, fingers intertwining with careful hesitation. They sat like that for a long time, connected by that simple touch, more intimate in its way than any embrace could have been. Outside, wind sighed through pine boughs heavy with snow. Inside, something fragile and new took root between them, born of shared pain and growing trust. Eventually, Emmett wrote with his free hand, "Thank you for not being afraid of my ghosts." "We all have ghosts," Sarah replied softly. "The lucky ones don't face them alone." She remained until his breathing deepened into sleep, their hands still joined. Only then did she gently disentangle her fingers and return to her own room, heart full of emotions she dared not yet name. The next morning brought no mention of their nighttime encounter. Emmett was already outside when Sarah woke, the smell of coffee indicating he'd at least paused long enough for breakfast before beginning his chores. She dressed and moved to the kitchen, finding a note on the table beside a covered plate. "Gone to North Pasture, back by noon, bread still warm." The simple domesticity of the gesture, ensuring she had breakfast waiting, touched Sarah deeply. In all her years with Thomas, he had never once considered her comfort or needs unless they directly served his own. After eating, she decided to tackle the pile of mending that had accumulated over the past weeks. As she worked, she found herself humming, then singing softly, old hymns and folk tunes flowing naturally from some long quiet place within her. So absorbed was she in music and mending that the sound of approaching horses didn't register until they reached the yard. Sarah set aside her work and moved to the window, surprised to see 3 riders dismounting. Raymond Blackwell led the group, accompanied by 2 men she recognized as bank employees. Fear spiked through her, Emmett was still in the north pasture. She was alone. Raymond mounted the steps and pounded on the door. "Mrs. Winters, I know you're in there. Open up!" Steeling herself, Sarah opened the door but remained firmly in the threshold, blocking entry. "Mr. Blackwell, what brings you here?" Raymond's handsome face was tight with barely controlled fury. "Where's Sullivan?" "Working his ranch, as hard-working men do," Sarah replied, pleased at how steady her voice sounded despite her racing heart. "What do you want?" "To serve these foreclosure papers properly." Raymond thrust a document toward her. "The ranch will be auctioned in 30 days unless all outstanding debts are paid." Sarah didn't take the papers. "Mayor Blackwell visited yesterday. He's aware the loan documents are forgeries." Something dangerous flashed in Raymond's eyes. "My father doesn't know everything that happens at the bank. Sullivan borrowed against this property and failed to pay. The law is clear." "We both know that's not true," Sarah said, her fear giving way to anger. "Just as we both know Thomas never borrowed money from you for gambling debts." Raymond's composure slipped. "Careful, Mrs. Winters. Accusing a bank officer of fraud is a serious matter, one that could land a woman like you in significant trouble." "A woman like me?" Sarah echoed, her voice hardening. "You mean a woman you thought you could frighten and control? A woman without resources or defenders?" She stepped forward, forcing Raymond to take a step back. "You miscalculated, Mr. Blackwell." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Raymond's face. Then his expression hardened. "Sullivan won't always be around to protect you, and when he's gone, you'll find Riverdale a very inhospitable place." The threat hung in the air between them. Sarah held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I've survived worse than you, Raymond. Now get off this property before Emmett returns. He's not as patient as I am." Raymond's jaw clenched. He turned to his companions. "Mark the date. When we take possession, I want everything inventoried." Then to Sarah, 30 days, Mrs. Winters. Enjoy your stay until then." The men mounted and rode away, Raymond's rigid back radiating fury. Only when they disappeared around the bend did Sarah allow her knees to buckle, sinking onto the porch steps as reaction set in. What had she done? Raymond was dangerous enough before. Now she'd challenged him directly, threatened his scheme. And while Mayor Blackwell might believe them, legal matters moved slowly. The foreclosure auction was only 30 days away. By the time Emmett returned, Sarah had composed herself enough to relate the encounter calmly. His expression darkened with each detail, his hand clenching around the chalk as he wrote, "Should have been here. Shouldn't have left you alone." "You couldn't have known they'd come," Sarah assured him. "Besides, I handled it. Raymond is dangerous when cornered." "I know." She hesitated. "Emmett, if the mayor can't stop the foreclosure in time, what will happen?" He considered for a moment before writing, "We'll fight it. Mayor has influence. But if we lose—" He paused, then continued, "I found gold once, can find it again elsewhere." The simple declaration, accepting possible loss yet facing it without fear, humbled Sarah. Emmett had built this place with his own hands, created a sanctuary from nothing. To lose it would be devastating. Yet he faced the prospect with quiet dignity, already looking toward what might come next. "Don't worry yet," he added, seeing her expression. "Truth usually wins eventually." Sarah wished she shared his faith in justice. Her experience suggested otherwise, that power and money typically prevailed, while truth languished unheard. But she nodded anyway, not wanting to dampen his determination. "What can I do to help?" she asked. "Keep teaching me to read. Knowledge is power they can't take." The afternoon's lesson held a new urgency, both of them aware that much more than literacy now hung in the balance. Emmett applied himself with redoubled focus, his progress noticeably accelerating as necessity drove learning. That evening, Sarah played the piano with particular feeling, letting music express the emotions too complex for words. Emmett sat nearby, eyes closed, tension gradually easing from his features as melodies filled the room. In this, at least, they could find temporary sanctuary from the troubles gathering outside their door. Later, as they prepared for bed, Emmett hesitated in the hallway between their rooms. He wrote slowly, deliberately. "Whatever happens, I'm grateful you came here, changed everything." "For me, too," Sarah admitted softly. "You've given me back parts of myself I thought were lost forever." His eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded once and disappeared into his room, leaving Sarah to wonder what might have been said if words came more easily to either of them. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Mayor Blackwell visited twice, bringing news of his investigation into Raymond's activities at the bank. The evidence was mounting, not just against Emmett, but against other property owners in the valley who had mysteriously fallen into debt. But legal processes moved slowly, and Raymond had allies on the bank's board of directors. "We need more concrete proof," the mayor explained during his second visit, "something that directly links Raymond to the forged documents." "What about my husband's supposed gambling debts?" Sarah asked. "Could those be connected?" "Almost certainly. Raymond's scheme seems to be creating false debts, then using them to acquire property or control people." Mayor Blackwell looked troubled. "I've discovered several similar cases, widows or elderly residents suddenly facing debts they never knew existed." The pattern was clear, but proving it remained challenging. Without direct evidence of Raymond's forgeries, it would be his word against theirs. And in Riverdale, the Blackwell name still carried significant weight, even without the mayor's support. As the foreclosure date drew nearer, tension mounted. Sarah threw herself into preparations for every possibility, cataloging Emmett's possessions, organizing important documents, identifying which items would need to be saved if they were forced to leave. Through it all, Emmett maintained a stoic calm, continuing his daily work while redoubling his efforts to learn reading. His progress was remarkable now that necessity drove him. Within 2 weeks, he could read simple sentences and write basic responses without help. One evening, as Sarah played the piano while snow fell gently outside, she realized Emmett was no longer in his usual chair. Turning, she found him standing at the window, his back rigid with tension. "Emmett, what's wrong?" He gestured for her to join him. Through the frosty glass, Sarah could make out an orange glow on the horizon, too bright and widespread to be lanterns or a campfire. "Fire," she breathed. "Where?" Emmett pointed toward the south pasture where the old hay barn stood. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Sarah followed, pulling on her own coat and boots. "I'm coming with you," she said when he tried to wave her back. Outside, the bitter cold stole her breath away, but the distant fire provided enough light to navigate by. They ran toward the blaze, snow crunching beneath their boots, the smell of smoke growing stronger with each step. By the time they reached the hay barn, it was fully engulfed, flames leaping skyward in a terrible dance. The heat was intense even from a distance, melting snow in a wide perimeter around the structure. "The animals," Sarah started, but Emmett shook his head. The barn had been used only for hay storage this winter. No livestock were housed there. As they watched helplessly, the barn's roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a plume of sparks into the night sky. Nothing could be saved now. The best they could do was ensure the fire didn't spread to nearby fields or structures. Emmett worked methodically, using snow to create fire breaks, while Sarah fetched buckets of water from a nearby stream to douse any flying embers. They labored in silent coordination until dawn broke, revealing the full extent of the destruction. Where the barn had stood, only charred timbers and smoldering ash remained. As the first light touched the scene, Sarah noticed something out of place. A scrap of fabric caught on a fence post near where the barn's door had been. She moved closer, careful of still hot debris. The fabric was unmistakable, fine wool with a distinctive green and black check pattern. Raymond's scarf, the one he'd been wearing when he visited the ranch. "Emmett," she called, pointing to the evidence. He examined the fabric, his expression darkening with each moment. There could be no doubt this was deliberate arson, a warning of what might come next. They returned to the house in grim silence, exhausted and soot-stained. As Sarah prepared coffee, desperately needed after their long night, she noticed Emmett standing at the window, staring back toward the destroyed barn. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" she said, though she already knew the answer. Emmett turned to her, his eyes reflecting a depth of anger she'd never seen before. He took up his slate. "Raymond, message that this is just the beginning." "We should tell the sheriff," Sarah suggested. "And say what? Fabric could belong to anyone." He was right. Without witnesses, they had no proof Raymond had set the fire. It would be their accusation against his denial. And as a bank officer and the mayor's son, his word would carry more weight than theirs. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Emmett's jaw set in determination. "We fight, not his way, our way." "And what way is that?" "Truth, in front of everyone." He outlined his plan quickly. They would confront Raymond publicly during Sunday service when the entire town would be present. Mayor Blackwell would be there, along with the bank's board of directors and every influential citizen of Riverdale. It would be their best chance to present their case directly to the community, circumventing Raymond's control of the legal process. The plan was bold, risky. It could backfire spectacularly, cementing their position as outsiders to be disbelieved and shunned. But with the foreclosure date looming and Raymond escalating to violence, they had few options left. "It could work," Sarah said slowly. "But what will you do? You don't—" She trailed off, reluctant to state the obvious limitation. Emmett hadn't spoken aloud to another person in 7 years. How could he confront Raymond without words? Understanding her concern, Emmett wrote, "We'll find a way, some things worth breaking silence for." The simple statement sent a shiver through Sarah. For 7 years, Emmett had carried his grief and guilt in silence, believing words had failed him when his brother needed him most. To consider speaking now, in public no less. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. After so long, he nodded, resolution clear in every line of his body. Then he wrote, "Tomorrow we prepare." The following days were devoted to gathering evidence, rehearsing what needed to be said, anticipating Raymond's possible counter-arguments. Sarah arranged their findings in clear, simple terms that even those without financial knowledge could understand. Emmett practiced forming words again, his voice rusty and halting from disuse. On Saturday evening, the night before their confrontation, nervous energy filled the house. Sarah played the piano more fervently than usual, letting music channel her anxiety into something beautiful. Emmett sat nearby, tension evident in the set of his shoulders, the furrow of his brow. During a pause between pieces, he wrote, "If this fails—" "It won't," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "If it does, if we lose the ranch, will you—" He hesitated, chalk hovering over slate, then finished, "Will you stay with me, wherever we go next?" The question took her breath away. It wasn't just about practical arrangements or their teaching agreement. It was about something deeper, something neither had yet named aloud. "Yes," she answered simply. "Wherever you go, I'll go with you." Relief and something warmer softened his features. He rose and moved to a small cabinet, withdrawing something wrapped in cloth. Returning to Sarah, he placed it in her hands. It was a book, not his mother's Bible, but a slim volume of poetry, its leather binding worn soft with handling. Opening it, Sarah found pressed between the pages a perfect yellow wildflower, preserved from some long-ago summer. "My mother's favorite," Emmett wrote. "Said beauty should be kept close during dark times. Reminded her that spring always returns." The gift, so personal and meaningful, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." He nodded, then wrote it with careful precision. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you brought spring back to this house. To me." Sarah looked up from the book to find Emmett watching her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Without conscious thought, Sarah rose from the piano bench and moved toward him. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant, a question asked and answered in the language of touch. When they parted, Emmett's eyes held a wonder that matched the drumming of Sarah's heart. He raised a hand to her cheek, fingertips tracing her features as if committing them to memory. No words were needed. Some truths transcended language. That night, as Sarah prepared for sleep, she felt strangely calm despite the confrontation awaiting them in the morning. Whatever happened in Riverdale tomorrow, something precious and immutable had taken root between them, something Raymond Blackwell and all his schemes could never touch. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the sky a brittle blue above snow-covered fields. Sarah dressed with particular care, choosing the best of the clothing she'd brought from town. Emmett, too, appeared in his Sunday finest, a dark suit rarely worn, his hair neatly combed, freshly shaven. The drive to town passed in charged silence, each lost in preparation for what lay ahead. As Riverdale's church came into view, its white steeple rising against the winter sky, Sarah reached over to squeeze Emmett's hand. "Remember," she said softly, "we have truth on our side." He nodded, returning the pressure of her fingers briefly before focusing again on guiding the horses through Riverdale's snowy streets. The church was already filled when they arrived, townsfolk settled into their usual pews. Sarah felt their curious stares as she and Emmett entered, the whispers that followed their progress down the aisle. Near the front, Raymond sat beside his father, his smug expression faltering slightly at their appearance. They took seats in the back, waiting as the service began with familiar hymns and prayers. Sarah sang quietly, her trained voice drawing occasional glances. Beside her, Emmett remained silent, his focus absolute. When Pastor Wilson rose to deliver his sermon, choosing as his text a passage about truth and justice, Sarah wondered if the mayor had quietly suggested the topic. The pastor spoke eloquently about the corrosive effects of lies, the importance of integrity, the community's responsibility to uphold righteousness. And now, Pastor Wilson concluded, before our final hymn, Mayor Blackwell has asked to address the congregation on a matter of community concern. This was unexpected. Sarah glanced at Emmett, who seemed equally surprised. They had planned to speak after the service, catching people before they dispersed. The mayor rising now changed their timing completely. Thomas Blackwell moved to the pulpit with the dignified bearing that had earned him respect throughout the valley. His grave expression silenced the usual rustles and whispers of the congregation. "Friends and neighbors," he began, "this is not an easy day for me, both as your mayor and as a father. For some time now, I have been investigating disturbing reports of financial irregularities affecting several properties in our community." A murmur rippled through the church. Raymond straightened in his seat, color draining from his face. These irregularities include falsified loan documents, forged signatures, and fraudulent foreclosure notices, Mayor Blackwell continued. Last night, after the fire at the Sullivan Ranch, additional evidence came to light that cannot be ignored. Sarah's breath caught. The mayor hadn't mentioned finding new evidence during his visits. What had happened? Hannah Wallace, our pastor's wife, came to me with information she could no longer, in good conscience, withhold. Mayor Blackwell gestured toward a small woman in the front pew who stood reluctantly. Mrs. Wallace witnessed my son Raymond threatening Sarah Winters on multiple occasions regarding debts she did not owe. She also observed him near the Sullivan property shortly before the fire was discovered. Gasps and whispers filled the church. Raymond half rose from his seat, fury contorting his features. "This is absurd. She's lying." "Sit down, Raymond." The mayor's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "Mrs. Wallace is not the only witness. Bank records examined this morning that show systematic manipulation of accounts, all bearing your signature as authorizing officer." The mayor turned to face the congregation directly. "I stand before you today, not just as your mayor, but as a father who has failed to see the truth about his own son. For that, I ask forgiveness from all who have suffered because of my blindness." The raw honesty of the admission silenced the room completely. Even Raymond seemed momentarily stunned. "Particularly," Mayor Blackwell continued, his voice softening, "I must apologize to Mrs. Sarah Winters, who has endured unjust accusations and harassment over debts that never existed, and to Emmett Sullivan, whose property and reputation have been threatened by schemes conducted partly through my own family's bank." He turned to where they sat. "Mrs. Winters, Mr. Sullivan, on behalf of Riverdale and myself personally, I offer my deepest apologies." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected vindication. Beside her, Emmett sat very still, his expression unreadable to most, but she recognized the subtle relaxing of his shoulders, the slight softening around his eyes that signaled profound emotion. Raymond recovered from his shock, rising fully now. "This is a conspiracy. You can't possibly believe—" "Enough, Raymond." Mayor Blackwell's voice held steel beneath the weariness. "Sheriff Miller is waiting outside to take your statement regarding these matters. The bank's board has already suspended you pending investigation." "You're choosing them over your own son?" Raymond's incredulity gave way to bitter laughter. "A mute freak and a woman who drove her husband to ruin. This is what your precious integrity gets you, alone in your old age, siding with outcasts against your own blood." The cruel words echoed in the stunned silence of the church. Sarah felt rather than saw Emmett tense beside her, then rise to his feet. Every head turned as Emmett Sullivan, known throughout Riverdale for his 7-year silence, walked deliberately to the front of the church. He stopped before Raymond, facing him directly. "I am not mute," he said, his voice rough from disuse but clear enough to carry through the hushed room. "I choose when to speak, and who deserves words." The simple declaration, delivered in that gravel-deep voice, sent a ripple of astonishment through the congregation. Raymond took an involuntary step backward, momentarily robbed of his usual arrogance. Emmett turned to address the gathered townspeople, his words coming slowly but with gathering strength. "I fought in the war, tried to save lives, failed to save my brother, came here to forget, but silence became a prison." He glanced at Sarah. "Mrs. Winters taught me to read, to speak again. She has more courage, more honor than most men I've known." The naked emotion in his voice silenced even the most avid gossips. This was not the rambling of a damaged mind, but the hard-won wisdom of a soul that had walked through fire. My ranch is my own, Emmett continued, focusing now on Raymond. Paid for with gold I found and sweat I spilled. No debts, no loans, just honest work. He stepped closer to Raymond, his physical presence imposing without being threatening. And Sarah Winters owes nothing to anyone, not money, not explanations, nothing. Raymond's face flushed with rage and humiliation. You think your little speech changes anything? You're still the town oddity, Sullivan, and she's still nothing but a— My future wife, Emmett interrupted, the words surprising even Sarah. If she'll have me. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Sarah's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead at double speed. They had discussed a future together, yes, but not marriage, not so soon, not so publicly declared. Raymond's laugh held an edge of desperation. You can't be serious, you barely know her. I know her heart, Emmett replied simply. More than enough. The contrast between the two men could not have been starker. Raymond's bitter contempt against Emmett's quiet dignity. Even those who had whispered about Sarah and Emmett's living arrangement found themselves moved by the simple honesty of his declaration. Sheriff Miller entered then, nodding respectfully to Mayor Blackwell before approaching Raymond. Mr. Blackwell, I need you to come with me to answer some questions about these financial matters. Raymond looked wildly around, seeking allies, finding none. His gaze landed on his father, a last appeal for intervention. The mayor met his son's eyes with profound sadness but unwavering resolve. Go with the sheriff, Raymond, he said quietly. Face this with whatever dignity you can muster. Something broke in Raymond's expression. The final realization that his schemes had failed, that not even his father would shield him from consequences. Without another word, he allowed Sheriff Miller to escort him from the church. In the silence that followed, Hannah Wallace rose again, moving to stand before Sarah. I should have spoken sooner, she said, voice trembling. I saw how Raymond threatened you, how he spread lies about you after Thomas died. I stayed silent out of fear, and I'm deeply sorry. Sarah took the older woman's hands in hers. Thank you for finding your courage now, when it mattered most. Pastor Wilson, recognizing the moment's importance, raised his hands. Let us end this service with a prayer for truth, reconciliation, and new beginnings in our community. As the congregation bowed their heads, Sarah found Emmett beside her again, his warm hand enveloping hers. The simple connection grounded her through the prayer, through the final hymn, through the curious but largely respectful greetings of townsfolk as the service ended. Outside in the crisp winter air, they finally found a moment alone. Did you mean it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. About marriage? Emmett nodded, reaching for her hands. This time he didn't need slate or chalk to express himself. Yes, he said simply. If you want. You don't think it's too soon? Even as she asked, Sarah knew the question was mere formality. In the weeks they'd spent together, they had shared more truth, more genuine understanding than many couples achieved in years. Life is short, Emmett replied, the words coming more easily now that the dam of silence had broken. Wasted enough time already. Sarah smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Then yes, my answer is yes. His rare, full smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and pain. He leaned down, sealing their promise with a kiss that drew a few gasps and more than a few smiles from lingering churchgoers. Mayor Blackwell approached as they parted, his expression weary but relieved. The foreclosure notices will be withdrawn immediately, he assured them, and I've already spoken with the bank about compensation for the burned barn. Thank you, Sarah said sincerely, and I'm sorry about Raymond. The mayor nodded, sadness evident in his lined face. My son made his own choices. Now he must face their consequences. He glanced between them. I couldn't help overhearing, congratulations are in order? Emmett nodded, his arms settling protectively around Sarah's shoulders. Spring wedding, he said, the two words containing volumes of meaning after the long winter they had endured. A new beginning, Mayor Blackwell agreed, something we could all use. As they drove home through the snow-covered landscape, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The ranch came into view, not grand or imposing, but solid, honest, a true home. Emmett helped her down from the wagon, his touch lingering. Welcome home, he said softly, words no longer rationed, but given freely. Sarah looked from the house to the man beside her, seeing in both the promise of healing, of growth, of something beautiful built from broken pieces. Home, she agreed, the word encompassing far more than timber and stone. That evening, Emmett brought out his mother's Bible. But instead of waiting for Sarah to read to him, he opened it himself and, with careful concentration, read aloud, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." The words, spoken in his deep, still rusty voice, filled the room like music, a different kind of song than Sarah's piano, but no less beautiful in its way. Outside, the last light of day painted the snow-covered fields in shades of rose and gold. Inside, two people who had known profound loneliness found in each other not just companionship, but true understanding. The revelation that some wounds heal best when shared, and some silences need breaking for the heart to truly speak. Emmett closed the Bible gently, looking up at Sarah with eyes that no longer guarded their emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, "for teaching me to read and to love again." Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "We taught each other," she corrected softly, "and we'll keep learning together." In the quiet that followed, they both recognized the truth of those words, that their journey was just beginning, that they would continue teaching and learning from each other for all the days that stretched before them. It was a future neither could have imagined in their darkest moments, yet one that now seemed inevitable, as natural as spring following winter. A home at last for both their wounded hearts. As spring arrived in Montana, it brought more than just wildflowers to the Sullivan Ranch. The old hay barn rose anew, its frame stronger than before, built with help from townspeople who had once whispered behind closed doors, but now worked alongside Emmett in the clear light of day. Sarah's piano music drifted across the valley most evenings, and sometimes, for those passing close enough to hear, a deep voice could be heard joining hers, halting at first, but growing more confident with each day. On a warm May morning, beneath an arch woven with yellow wildflowers that matched those pressed in Emmett's book of poetry, Sarah and Emmett exchanged vows before the community. Mayor Blackwell stood as witness, his face reflecting both the joy of the occasion and a quiet determination to right past wrongs. Hannah Wallace had sewn a simple white dress for Sarah, her way of making amends. "Some silences need breaking," she whispered as she helped arrange Sarah's hair, "and some stories need telling, even when they're hard." After the ceremony, Emmett led Sarah to a small hill behind the house where a sapling aspen stood newly planted. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "Our future," Emmett said, his voice no longer a stranger to his own ears. He took her hand, placing it alongside his against the slender trunk. "Aspens grow in groves, all connected under the ground. One tree is never alone." Sarah smiled up at the man who had taught her to trust again, just as she had taught him to speak. "Neither are we," she said softly. Together they walked back toward the cabin that had sheltered them through the darkest winter, now transformed by love and truth into something neither had dared to hope for. Not just a house, but a home where wounded hearts could finally heal.